Begin with thanks. Thanks to those who initiated the idea of this colloquium, this symposium. Thanks to those who in one way or another were involved in its organization. Thanks to those who have accepted to give talks and addresses. Thanks to all those who have come to participate in the discussions. In a word, thanks to one and all. I've entitled this inaugural lecture, this initial communication, The Nomadic Intellect, as a salutation to a book several people in the audience will have read, others at least heard of, as one of the elements, among other recent attempts here in Scotland, to recover the country's original intellectual, cultural energies and try to open up a new field. I'm referring, of course, as some of you will already recognize, I'm referring to George Davies' The Democratic Intellect, 1961, and its ominously titled sequel, 1986, The Crisis of the Democratic Intellect. Now, I don't intend on this occasion to go into the whole theory of the dramatic intellect, which involves a multitude of paths and, I risk saying, evolves in a space at once more open, more radical, more acute than the democratic intellect, which is a space I respect entirely, but I feel the need of a field of energy going into a much stronger territory. In the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, T.E. Lawrence called nomadism the most deep and biting social discipline. He was referring, of course, to the pastoral nomadism of the Bedouin. What I've called intellectual nomadism, for some years now, is the most deep and biting of mental disciplines. I lay out its mapping and making, its mapping and its making, in a book entitled L'Esprit Nomade, Paris 1987, which is at present being translated at last into English, after several other languages, and will appear in the collected works now underway at the University of Aberdeen. What I intend to do this morning in your company is a general overview, providing the sense of a whole itinerary in which I hope you will share, referring it to your own experiences, keeping in mind the theme, of course, of France and Scotland, which is a central aspect of my own life. In the first place, let's take a quick look into that word existential. When we get right down to basics, and one must now and again, when we get right down to basics, there's a whole society around us trying to avoid anything like basics, anything like thought, in fact. When we get right down to basics, the root words we use are living, being, existence. These are the key words, the root words: living, being, existence. Living is first and foremost a biological term. Living is a biological term, moving into the sociological and the economic. There's a whole gradation there. Being is a hazier notion, and it can move up into metaphysics. In fact, the whole of Western metaphysics is based on that small word being, whatever be the language. Going back to Greek. Existence is a tougher term, tougher to grasp, tougher still to extend and expand. The whole process began for me, and here again I invite everybody to refer to their own experiences. The whole process began for me in a small seaport village on the west coast of Scotland. I dwelt there for years in a kind of oceanic consciousness, oceanisches Gefühl, as Freud said. A kind of oceanic consciousness full and fertile in multiple sensations and perceptions. That was the basis for me. Then I began to read philosophy, from Plato on. And the notion of being took over. And I asked myself, what is this being? What does that mean to say I am? This concept of being turned up a lot in my early poems and essays. Afterwards I dropped it. But it turned up a lot in the early poems and essays. It was in Glasgow, however, that I started to exist. And it was a chilly kind of experience. I roamed about the streets of Glasgow at that time, 1950s. You know, they were still at the tail end of the Industrial Revolution. Hell was still around, in a sense. So I roamed about the streets in a black anorak, symbolical black anorak, somewhere between Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Hesse's Wolf of the Steppe. My thought moving between an archaic fundamentalism and an anarchic kind of nihilism. That was me as a student in Glasgow. With the music, I come from a musical family, but I chose poetry, but there's a lot of music and poetry, obviously. With the music running through my head, made up of Brecht's Threepenny Opera, Scottish and Irish folk song, and snatches of quotations from Rimbaud's Season in Hell. As a student in this city, situated between Chicago and Moscow, I was always hunting for books, usually among the second-hand barrows, then clustered around the central station. It was in one of them that I came across The Lives of the Scottish Poets by David Irving, a book published in 1810. In it, Irving has a page on John Cameron. I'm a Cameron on my mother's side, who is professor of Greek at the university here. About Cameron, Irving has this to say: being seized with the desire of visiting foreign countries, he soon relinquished his situation, and in the year 1600 passed over to France, the favourite region of Scottish wanderers. The favourite region of Scottish wanderers. Now, there we're already into the Franco-Scottish connection, part of our thematics. Before going into the larger aspects of our theme, into the existential aspect, shall we say, let me just confirm and strengthen the strands of the general Franco-Scottish connection, seeing it in all its depth and scope, which is very rarely done. Here's Alfred North Whitehead, Englishman, in his Adventures of Ideas, 1932. Adam Smith and David Hume are two of the last great Scotchmen, says vocabulary, two of the last great Scotchmen who marked the traditional affiliation of Scotland with France. At their date, the intellectual life of Edinburgh and Glasgow is not to be assimilated with that of England. Throughout the greater part of the 18th century, during its central portion, the intellectual life of England, so far as concerns any originative energy, is negligible. In my early days in Ayrshire, Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, was the only modern English writing philosopher I was deeply interested in. His Process and Reality, an essay in cosmology, originally a series of lectures, Gifford lectures, delivered at the University of Edinburgh, 1927-1928, was a key book for me, Process and Reality. Throughout Whitehead's books, you can come across phrases like that: originative energy, emerging lines of thought, that struck my brain like lightning. And the general tenor of Process and Reality seemed to me like a program. In each age of the world, distinguished by high activity there will be found at its culmination, and among the agencies leading to that culmination, some profound cosmological outlook. That's what I'm trying to get at. That's what we're trying to get at in geopolitics. That's what we're trying to get at during these talks, lectures, discussions, these 3 days. Let me just repeat that. In each age of the world, distinguished by high activity, there aren't that many in the history of the world, there will be found at its culmination, and among the agencies leading to that culmination, some profound cosmological outlook. One last confirmation before going on. I could multiply the examples. One last confirmation before going on. In his book on the Atlantic Republican tradition, another book that meant a lot to me, the Atlantic Republican tradition, J.G.A. Pocock lays a lot of emphasis on those Scottish and French conjectural historians who, outside all mere historicism, try to see emergent lines in time. Emergent lines in time. This first Glasgow period of my itinerary came to an end with my finals here in Glasgow. Finals in French and German with Latin and philosophy on the side. Now those finals I was lucky, very lucky. My external examiner was Enid Starkey, professor of French at Oxford, biographer of Rimbaud, Arthur Rimbaud. Had she been a specialist of Racine, I would have done what was necessary, but with less enthusiasm. Whereas he, I had the biographer of Rimbaud in front of me. So what started out as an examination turned into an animated conversation. Starkey ended up by saying that in all her teaching days, she'd never seen my like. You know, that kind of pleased me, shall we say. Anyway, what's more important is that I came away with a bursary for a postgraduate study in Paris. I left for Paris in the autumn of 1959 to live there with Marie-Claude, who's in the audience, whom I met in Glasgow, where she was an assistante, and where she was going to be working at the Sorbonne on a memoir devoted to Lewis Grassic Gibbon, in particular his A Scots Square. For a couple of years, living in small rooms, very small rooms, with Marie-Claude, you know, seventh floor, cold water flats. Living in small rooms with Marie-Claude, while working like hell in libraries. I wandered all over Paris, from Montparnasse to Montmartre, from the Mont Sainte-Geneviève, where the old Scots College stood, to Place Blanche, from the quays of the Seine to the Haut Canal, famous for its suicides, duking into dives and cafes here and there, frequenting the studios of painters, talking with a variety of characters from street tramps to hyper-intellectuals. Then we moved out to Meudon, 10 minutes southwest from Montparnasse railway station. This I learned. I didn't realize at the beginning that I learned this once I was on the spot. This I learned was the area, Meudon, Clamart, those little outskirts of Paris, where a lot of Russian exiles, such as Berdiev and Shestov, had settled. It was where the Russian philosophical boat, as the Russians say, where the Russian philosophical boat registered in Kiev, found a temporary harbor. I could still hear Russian in the streets. I could talk with some of those exiles or their descendants in the taverns. A strange coincidence, but these coincidences turn up all the time. A strange coincidence was that Louis-Ferdinand Céline, author of Voyage au bout de la nuit, Voyage to the End of Night, a book I must have read 10 times during my student years in Glasgow, had just died there, only a few hundred yards from where we were living. Leaving his last book, Rigaudon. Rigaudon is a crazy kind of dance. Rigaudon, a chronicle of clownish history dedicated to the animals. Alongside my first thesis on politics and poetics in the context of surrealism, I was working then at a collection of essays provisionally entitled Marx, Freud, and the Third Eye, and at a crazy manuscript entitled Incandescent Limbo, which, I mean, all kinds of elements, situations and projections and encounters, etc., 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 was fundamentally perhaps an existential auto-analysis. I was working my way on several planes at once, from the political to the poetical, via the philosophical, into something original. Maybe the titles of Incandescent Limbo's 7 chapters, 7 rooms, 7 chapters, will be enough here to provide an approximate idea. Here are the 7 chapters. Notes of a Nothing Man, on the Hyperborean Fringe, a short introduction to Eskimo studies, The Hermit of the Rue Gay-Lussac, a little place in nowhere, It's Raining Tea in Darjeeling, The Cabinet of White Meditation. Now, after that preliminary little introduction to my general itinerary, I propose to look closely with you from this perhaps singular position at the whole field of what the Americans call French theory. My particular involvement in and angle of view upon this French theory may be useful in the English language context. First of all, to perturb a little, if possible, the kind of intellectual complacency that came across in the interview I heard once of an English Don from Cambridge, in which he declared that he was not really aware of continental thought. Second, and this is more complex, this is more subtle, to shed light on my perhaps particular relationship to French literature and thought, which differs, perhaps, from mine certainly 10 times more demanding than that of our Don, both in Britain and the US, but perhaps who often pick up and stick to French theories that have undergone criticism and more deeply overpassing in France itself. I was there on the spot in the middle of it all, and that may be useful to hear something about it. I did a lot of this kind of, along with those French intellectuals I was speaking about later, a lot of this kind of undermining and overpassing. Often, I mean, this kind of thing happens all over the place, often to the wrath and the reaction of more established French intellectuals and literati. Here's an anecdote that illustrates this. I published some pieces in French magazines when Maurice Nadeau asked me to write articles for his Quinzaine littéraire, which was one of the main critical reviews of the time. I might begin these articles, which were in fact essays. Nadeau gave me whole pages for his magazine, whole pages. These were essays, not articles. So I might begin these essays, articles, as I say, Nadeau gave me all the space I wanted, about some recent literary production. But I always took the opportunity to broach larger themes. This broaching of larger themes resulted in my receiving letters from French readers saying, don't take this as immodest, simply as fact. At last, something live on the scene. I got a lot of letters like that. But, of course, at the same time, a reaction was growing. There was a reaction from the established intellectuals and literati, mostly literati. At one point, Nadeau said to me, the next time you come into Paris, I was living in Pau at that time, the next time you come into Paris, do it in an armoured car. For they're out to get you. They want to gun you down. I mean, it's as simple as that. So, over the years, there was a certain amount of gun popping. In France, to put it in another way, I've never just been a quiet guest. Far from being, of course, an American in Paris or a Scotsman in Paris. No, I've never been a quiet guest, but an active participant. And that can be an irritant. an active participant in what I considered, and still do, the deepest and liveliest intellectual field in Europe, in the world, maybe, to which Scotland was always close. Now let's look into the deep lines and work out some coordinates in that field. When I arrived in France, let me say that before beginning, I may be mentioning here the names of thinkers and writers, perhaps unfamiliar to some in the audience. That's possible. But you don't have to know the names to follow the ideas, right? Like being too close to the names can prevent following out the ideas. When I arrived in France, the key word was structure. Structure. Structure here, structure there, structure everywhere. Now, structuralism, which is still around in various universities. Structuralism began with a new look into text. A new look into text. For example, in the study of semio-narrative structures with Greimas, or the structures of the imagination with Gilbert Durand, the structures of the imagination. Structure became the key word, developing from a literary methodology into a whole conceptual system. Lévi-Strauss, ex-philosopher turned ethnologist, transferred it to family organization and anthropology, and it still goes the rounds, very much so, in some areas. Soon, it was all over the board, running from linguistics to biology via the science of cognition, giving rise to a new formation of the intelligentsia. That happens a lot in France, less elsewhere. Giving rise to a new formation of the intelligentsia, a new intellectualist community, which is a stage further down, with new rituals of communion, with which I had nothing to do, and said so. I never saw in structuralism any more than a kind of halfway house. If it was a search for deeper formations than the common ones, if it could be empirically valid in specific contexts, that I can see. It seemed to me, it still seems to me, short in theory, very short in theory, and might have stemmed ultimately, this is a hypothesis, might have stemmed ultimately from a desire to grab hold of at least something in the general emptiness of the long post-war period. France knew a long post-war period, which was very hazy, sometimes floozy. That long post-war period, it was maybe an attempt to, that long post-war period where, in which the last lightning strokes of surrealism, had given way to Sartrean existentialism that hovered, Sartrean existentialism hovered between nightclub libertarianism, an often hasty, over-hasty political engagement, with, in between, nauseous boredom. That was the situation. Structuralism was maybe an attempt to get at some lines within this rather hazy situation. What was trying to find its way, as I saw things, and as I was trying to work at things with people I'm going to mention, what was trying to find its spaces, what was trying to find its spaces, its places, and its paces, was a whole post-structuralist movement. And I accentuate the word movement. The first sign of it, as I see it, came across in an essay published in 1963 by Henri Lefebvre in the Cahiers internationaux de sociologie, entitled Réflexions sur le structuralisme et l'histoire. Le structuralisme et l'histoire. Reflections on structuralism and history. Later picked up in his book of 1971, where it was even plainer, Au-delà du structuralisme, beyond structuralism. The very juxtaposition of those two words, structuralism and history, says Lefebvre at the beginning of his essay, indicate the matter of a considerable debate destined to be in the forefront of contemporary thought. Unfortunately, he goes on, debates in themselves never lead to much except more debating. How to get out of it all, how to get into another space, how to get into another field, that is the question posed at the end of Lefebvre's essay. And there's no immediate, definitive, simple answer. But the radical antinomy appearing on the horizon, on the mental horizon, on the intellectual horizon, on the creative horizon, was that between structure and movement. We're moving from structure to movement, from model to way, from structure to movement, from model to way, implying consequences in theory and in practice, in politics, in philosophy, and in literature. That was the field I was working in, with others whom I'll be mentioning. That was what interested me and what I was involved in. Involvement being one step further than interest. You can be interested in anything. So that was the way, that was the beginning of the way of the intellectual nomad, in fact. This anti-structuralist position was continued into the practice of deconstruction, which everyone has heard of, but has perhaps not always gone into. It became a kind of shibboleth at one time. As put forward and put into effect by Jacques Derrida, a book, a way of thought which was exemplified for me mainly in his book GLAS, G-L-A-S, G-L-A-S. When I first saw this huge format volume in a bookshop's window with that word G-L-A-S, GLAS, which means in French nail, as you know, emblazoned on its cover, I couldn't help thinking of Glasgow, where, amid the tolling of ecclesiastical bells, there were a lot of them then, and the booming of municipal clocks, I had myself the knell of a certain history. And I've been doing a lot of deconstruction on my own. What deconstruction meant in Derrida's clandestine book, his early books were clandestine, later they turned into something else. What Derrida was doing at the beginning of his work, and in that book, GLAS, was picking holes in Hegel, breaking down that last great cultural historical monument. He was breaking down a monument, trying to get into a movement, from monument to movement. After that erosion of Hegelianism, Derrida turned to the dissemination of being, the dissemination of being. Being no longer as a block, but as a dissemination. And from there to the white page. The white page in which, in an extraordinarily inspired moment, the poet Mallarmé was able only to space out a multitude of scattered work notes. We're not talking about 500-page novels now, we're talking about a different type of literature entirely. Space out a multitude of scattered work notes. In more general terms, both political and literary, Derrida was moving out from the Marxist heritage of dialectics, which had a long life in France, but had less of a long life in Britain, but nobody understood Marx in Britain anyway, so it didn't matter. He was trying to get out from Marxist dialectics, what he called, with humor, but also with deep intention, galactics. Now, what lurked in this latter term was the possibility, a perpetually delayed possibility. Derrida played a lot on the words différence. Différence meaning difference. But he spells it not with a ni, but with a ne. Différence, and that means it's going to be delayed. Différer is also to delay. So he plays on this. He plays a lot on words. But the possibility of a new logic, a new text. It was in this general movement I saw also Foucault, Lyotard, and Deleuze. Again, these names many will know very well. Others may hear for the first time, no matter. What counts are the ideas. In the early 60s, Foucault had begun his study Histoire de la folie à l'âge classique, a history of madness in the classical age. This historical philosophical investigation was, as its title indicated, a study of mental illness and psychiatric practice. Ronnie Lang was doing the same thing, roughly the same thing here in Glasgow, in his book, The Politics of Experience, for example. But it rapidly turned into an examination of the whole imaginary landscape and epistemological scene of the Renaissance. The themes of this early study, the relationship between individual and institution, that between power structures and knowledge. These are basic themes. The dialectic of sense and society. the nature and processes of the thinking and writing author were developed in other books by Foucault, such as Les mots et les choses, Words and Things, a radical theme, and L'archéologie du savoir, the archaeology of knowledge, the archaeology of knowledge. What is the basis of our knowledge, and so on. On that basis, let's follow out the lines rapidly this morning, but giving some idea of it at least. Follow out the lines of an emergent configuration with all kinds of elements coming in and finding their geometry. In 1973, there appeared in Paris a book with, for me, a significant title, Dérive à partir de Marx et de Freud. Drifting away from Marx and Freud. Drifting away. It's that drifting movement. By Jean-François Lyotard. It was significant for the psychosociological context in France at the time. And for me, it wasn't only significant, it was coincidental again. In that I was working at the time on a book entitled Travels in the Drifting Dawn. Even the titles were close. Seeing the whole time-space beginning to emerge as the years of the Great Drift. The years of the Great Drift in Europe were taking place at that time. The little Englanders weren't quite aware. Lyotard's notion of the drift also coincided, at least in part, with mine, that there would be no prescribed schedule, no invented plot to be worked out. It was Mark Twain in that River book, Huckleberry Finn, who said that from now on, anyone talking about plot should be shot. It was crudely put, but you understand. No prescribed schedule, no invented plot to be worked out, no totality to be arrived at. This idea of totality, as Lyotard said, being the model of Hegelian dialectics and all of bourgeois thought and practice. All of bourgeois thought and practice. Most proletarian thought and practice, not or hardly ever inventing something new, but simply being against bourgeois practice. The thing is to try and find something new. I mean, proletarian literature as practiced in Russia and in France and elsewhere was only the other side of bourgeois literature, as it were. But it was the same structure. So the drift that I'm trying to get at, present, was rather like a maelstrom of fragments, the mind process involved being both oceanic and seismographic. As Lyotard wrote in his book Rudiments païens, Pagan Rudiments, getting back into the territory, into the pagus. The old Platonico-Christian canvas is in shreds. All the attempts to mend it, even the Marxist ones, are falling apart. The only possibility left was to move towards, and here I quote Lyotard, and I was listening, I was chiming in, a region that semiotics has no notion of. A region like those white spaces indicating unknown land in the cartography of signs. Those white spaces indicating unknown land in the cartography of signs. And I come to Gilles Deleuze, with whom I was most in personal contact. We were by no means personal friends, but we were in personal contact a bit. In that he was invited to be in the jury of the thesis, the second thesis, my first I dropped. The second thesis was called Intellectual Nomadism. This was at the Sorbonne in 1979. He accepted to be part of the jury, saying he already knew of my work. Now, the presentation of my thesis at the Sorbonne went, shall we say, extremely well. And after a glowing report of his own, Deleuze signed the report prepared by my patron, the Americanist Michel Gresset, who had said this work of mine wasn't only, I'm quoting him, a remarkable thesis, but one which opened up a new field of study. That was something else. Not just a good thesis, but something which opened up a new field. Given all this, given this illustrative relationship with Deleuze, whom I liked a lot, whose work I admired, I was a little surprised, just a little surprised to see, a few years later, in the book he wrote with Félix Guattari, Mille Plateaux, I saw Deleuze taking issue with me on 2 points. One, my Celticism, and the other, my Orientalism. It wasn't a head-on attack. He wasn't attacking me. Some journalist said he was attacking me. He wasn't attacking me. But he was casting suspicion on this aspect of my movement and my work. As if, on the one hand, yeah, the other thing he found disquieting in my work was, alongside Celticism, was my Orientalism. As if, on the one hand, I was a kind of one-eyed Celtomaniac, brandishing a claymore, I don't know, or something like this. I don't know what these images were, but they were certainly false. And on the other, a potential guru. And both counts, a dangerous character. Now, Deleuze, as I say, wasn't attacking me. He was casting suspicion, though, objectively. And my little enemies, the gun poppers, they loved it. At last, they had a philosopher on their side saying I was a bad guy. It was really quite simplistic. Now, to take this a little seriously, though, I think it hardly merits it. I made it clear in essay after essay, poem after poem, exactly what my position was on Celticism, into which I worked a lot and which I spoke about openly. In very general terms, what interested me was a current of culture and thought gone underground in Europe, not only in the Celtic countries, Scotland, Ireland, etc., but in the whole of Europe, had gone underground and been lost to sight. And I insisted on what I considered to be the salient intellectual features of it, my references being not to some militant discourse or some romantic image, even less, but to, and here are my references in the Celtic field, John Scott Erigena, Duns Scott, and others of that ilk. If Deleuze, flanked by Guattari, chose to stick to more commonplace and history-bound references, it was perhaps on the one hand because they knew nothing else, but also because maybe this is more true of Guattari than of Deleuze, maybe they felt, or Guattari felt, I was sort of treading on their grass. So they wanted to sort of keep me aside. Now, this ignorance regarding Celtic culture, total ignorance, prevailed also in the domain of Orientalism. I use that, it's a floozy word, but it's useful. In his Production de l'Espace, Lefebvre, again, these French intellectuals I admire and work with, Lefebvre asks this in his Production de l'Espace. What do we know about Asian spatiality and ideograms? But he never took the trouble to find out. In L'Archéologie du Savoir, Foucault confessed to total incompetence and remained satisfied with the confession. In his book on Foucault, Deleuze comes to the question and makes a conjecture. If we're to attain to a life with an outside force, how do we know it won't be a terrifying, unbreathable void? The void scared them. Now, this might have entailed an entry into the vast field of Sunyata studies, extreme Buddhist studies, but it didn't. It was dropped. And in Mille Plateau, with regard to my own case, Deleuze, and this really disappointed me a lot. I mean, this is Deleuze talking. He started using things like yoga, Tao, Zen, and all that. Phew. Okay, pass on. Let's take things higher up. It all hinged in final terms on the opening and the coordination of a space outside normal conditions and containments. Foucault, to come back to his analysis, had begun to approach this space. He saw the classical humanist model of human being, already eroded by the economic determinism of Marx and the psychoanalysis of Freud, disappearing like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the tide, saying that he himself spoke from a white space. But he never went deeply into it. In Foucault's later work, the only signs we see of the possibility of that other space, that other more open existential and intellectual space, are the work notes for a lecture, Des Espaces Autres, Other Spaces, never composed or developed, set aside in fact, published only years later in the journal Architecture, Mouvement, Continuité, and in English in the review Diacritics. In these notes, Foucault launches the term heterotopie, other places, other spaces, heterotopie, presenting as examples, among several others, the old Maison Close and the clubmen. To say the least, all this is a crushing reduction of that white space he evoked in the archaeology of knowledge. There's this rundown there. But it was enough, of course, for semi-intellectuals in France and elsewhere, semi-intellectuals, to start talking about heterotopology. Wow, this was a new thing. Heterotopology. And for somebody like Edouard Soja in the United States, whose merit had been to introduce Henri Lefebvre's work into English language, Edward Soja was totally enthusiastic about heterotopology. So enthusiastic that he pumped it up into what he called third space. 1996, third space. Third space is pure bubble gum. In the absence of anything like a really live intellectual field, all kinds of blockbusters can be concocted from a peck of superficial theorization wrapped in a mass of statistics and descriptions, 500 pages of more or less nonentity. Now, having worked with differences alongside these French thinkers, I continued working in that space thing on my own via essay and what I called way book, neither novel nor travel writing, and poem. And I come now to the last part of my talk, this morning's talk. So, after going into theory and given some sense of a personal itinerary, it remains perhaps in this concluding section to give some idea of the social strategy of the intellectual nomad. We've been talking in intellectual terms. Now I want to talk in terms of social strategy, because I've never forgotten society and social space. When I came from Glasgow, a French critic once said of me, I was a social activist who at times went into long retreats. He was right about the dialectic, but he got the emphasis wrong and inverted the elements. I think rather I'm a loner, at one with the universe and the whole of world culture, as much as possible, who sometimes makes public incursions. What's true in any case, that this double movement exists as a kind of dialectic in my life. When I broke with Britain in the late 60s, I spent 9 years in the Pyrenees, publishing next to nothing, but shall we say, working like hell, writing about 9 books, working undergroundedly with my eye on the high line of the Pyrenees for 9 years, completely outside. When I started publishing again, after 9 years silence in the Pyrenees, having broken with Britain, and I started publishing again, book after book, at the speed of the Ganges, as Nietzsche says, a literary critic said in an article in one of the main newspapers, this fellow must never sleep. In fact, I sleep quite a lot. Maybe not so much as Descartes, who was always sleeping, but a full share to let the neurons recharge and ready for new synapses. Before going deeper into the nature of this dialectic, this paradox, if you like, which in my mind and my practice is outside that of, I'm talking about the intellectual normative, this practice is outside the intellectuel engagé, so often well-meaning but short-sighted. Beyond that of the mediatic intellectual, the intellectual of the media, a very strong thing in France, less here. The mediatic individual who week in, week out, month in, month out, comments more or less philosophically on events and participates regularly in debates. Debates that lead to debates that lead to debates ad infinitum. Of this dialectical paradoxical activity, a few concrete examples. While lone wolfing in Glasgow around 1966, I set up the Jargon Group, devoted to what I called cultural revolution and ontological revolution, 1966. When, after deciding Britain wasn't quite ready yet for anything like ontological cultural revolution, I left for France in 1967. I continued the Glasgowian work with a route I called feuillage, a word the Francophile-American Walt Whitman used in one of his poems. Always our old feuillage, always the free range and diversity. All of this you'll have noticed, the Glasgow thing, and the first thing down in the Pyrenees, was well before the revolt of May 68, before, in which I participated in my own way, with a certain inner distance. In 68, in the movement and the manifestation of 68 in France, they were all either very Trotskyist or Maoistic, very Maoistic. And at that time, my motto was not Mao, the Tao. It was a bit crazy at the time, but it was less crazy 5-10 years later. I mean, the first man who published one of the first books I did after my 9 years silence was an ex-Maoist. And this book that he published was called Letters from Gougonel, which was an absolute retreat in the heart of nature. I mean, at that time, I would have been branded as a total deviationist. But 10 years later, no. Another space was opening. After 68, in the early 70s in Paris, I set up another group. This lone wolf individual is always setting up groups. So in the 70s in Paris, I set up another group with another Romeo type review. We were Romeo typing like mad. I called this one the Feathered Egg. Its motto being, eggs need hatching. That's a Chinese proverb I invented for the occasion. Eggs need hatching, meaning by this, that in May 68 had broken shells, definitely, and made a kind of omelette baveuse. It hadn't yet created wings for flight. 9 years later, after more teaching, I've always considered university teaching as the oral prolongation of my silent thinking. In 1989, 2 centuries after the French Revolution, by the way, I set up the International Institute of Geopoetics so as to propagate the idea of geopoetics, a theory practice that had emerged in my mind after long years of intellectual nomadism. It's all connected. Across territories, intellectual nomadism, across territories and cultures. I did this. I started up this institute in 1989 after going into long study of all kinds of organization. How can things be organized? Can there be new forms of organization? So I was asking myself this kind of question. I'd been mulling one of them over for years. After setting up the institute, again, I'm interested in the prolongation of institutions. After setting up the institute, I proposed the creation of geopoetic groups across the world, working according to local conditions. That was my idea. They would have the idea of geopoetics, and they would use them in local conditions. Groups have been set up, temporary or lasting, in France, Scotland, Belgium, Italy, Serbia, Russia, Chile, and others are in the making. For various reasons. Principal among them being the absence of the fundamental texts. I mean, books of mine such as L'Esprit Nomade, Le Plateau de l'Albatros, Au Large de l'Histoire, which are absolutely necessary for a full understanding of geopoetics, don't yet exist in English, but they will. They will. In any case, all of the groups are aware of the general significance of the concept, and all are careful not to let the term run down into the kind of banal usage that has befallen, for example, the term surrealist. What an abuse is made of that word. Or even the term existentialist. That also is bandied about a lot in very superficial ways. The Institute, which houses a selection of the principal texts and now exists in 8 languages, you can tune into it, now exists in 8 languages, remains the central point of reference. That is the central point of reference. As in all organizational practice, all lucid and long-lasting organizational practice, the question is always one of inspiration and application. Inspiration and application are both necessary. Now let's look at things in a final paragraph or two from a distance or from higher up. That there is in the world today a great unrest is the least that can be said. The title of Freud's diagnosis, Civilization and Its Discontents, comes to mind. A book that meant a lot to me when I first read it as an adolescent in Largs on the West Coast. Most of the political discourse, not all of it, but most of it, most of the political discourse current, most of the cultural discourse current, however well-meaning and with partial relevance, relevance, but often with perverse results. You have to be careful in action that you don't get the perverse results. It's totally, I submit, inadequate to the context. The fundamental paradigm in civilization is that between the nomad and the sedentary. The one moving in space, the other establishing a politics. I neglect neither the one nor the other. But I'd move towards a kind of spatial politics. As the old political phrase puts it, as I say, this opposition between nomad and sedentary, here, this is an old Latin phrase, nomade sunt civilidatem non habent. They are nomads, they don't have civilization. That's the fundamental opposition. And it has all kinds of repercussions, prolongations, and so on. Now, at the moment, that there is a discontent and a distrust in politics today, often expressed in a very confused manner, certainly, is just as evident as the general civilizational unrest, of which it is a part. And this may be based ultimately on the fact that, as etymology shows, politics is of the city, polis, the city, to the neglect of their territory, which is why the most public critique of politics at the moment, I'm going beyond simply the unrest and the reaction to critique, the most public critique of politics at the moment comes from ecology, with reason, giving rise to an extension and expansion of politics as eco-politics, the terms vary. In German they speak of Erdpolitik, earth politics. They all turn more or less around the same concepts, the same practice. Now, I would say that eco-politics, earth politics, as I say, they're going in the right direction. That's how the phrase puts it. But I would say they're still too superficial, representing, I would say, only an intermediary stage. It will take more, and this is what I've been trying to get at this morning, which we'll perhaps be getting at within the next few days also. It will take more than a mix of ecology and politics to get at a full Earth existence, a grounded culture, a live and lasting open world, a full Earth existence. That's what we're after. A full Earth existence, a grounded culture, a live and lasting open world. Having tried in this initial talk to lay out one man's attempts to get at a deeper scheme of things and work out the coordinates of a project, while broaching questions that will no doubt be developed in various ways throughout our symposium, it only remains for me, this morning of the 29th May 2018 in the city of Glasgow, to thank you for listening to me.